Episode 227, entrepreneur and coach Bobbi Kahler.
And after lunch, well, number one, it was near Thanksgiving. So they served like a turkey and gravy and mashed potatoes. I think everyone might have been sleeping.
I'm Mark Graban. This is My Favorite Mistake. In this podcast, you'll hear business leaders and other really interesting people talking about their favorite mistakes. Because we all make mistakes, but what matters is learning from our mistakes instead of repeating them over and over again. So this is the place for honest reflection and conversation, personal growth, and professional success. Visit our website at myfavoritemistakepodcast.com. To learn more about Bobbi, her coaching, her podcast, and more, look for links in the show notes or go to markgraban.com/mistake227. Well, hi, everybody. Welcome back to My Favorite Mistake. I'm Mark Graban. Our guest today is Bobbi Kahler. She's an entrepreneur. She has been for more than 20 years. Bobbi has coached upwards of 3,000 people. She's delivered presentations for tens of thousands of people. Bobbi helps people see new possibilities for themselves and for their lives. Her undergraduate degree was in human performance improvement, and her graduate degree was based on the science of human flourishing. So we'll have a lot to talk about beyond her favorite mistake story today. Bobbi has a podcast. It's called The Unyielded Show, Thriving No Matter What. She's the author of Travels of the Heart, Developing Your Inner Leader, and she was a contributing author to the best-selling book, Masters of Success. So Bobbi, thank you for joining us here. How are you?
I'm doing great, Mark. Thank you for having me as a guest.
So there's a lot to explore, but as we always do here, we talk about the mistake thing. So before we get into other topics about leadership and what people can do to sort of help improve their lives and their work, I'm going to ask you the question here. I'll quit stumbling my way into it. Bobbi, the different things you've done in your work, what would you say is your favorite mistake?
I love that question because as we were talking beforehand, there's so many that come to mind. But the one that I think is one of my favorites is something that when I was just getting started, this was back in the early 2000s. I was getting started in my speaking career, and I'd been hired to do this, it was an all-staff training day for a credit union. And I was super excited, and I was going to do one session in the morning and one right after lunch. They were both 90 minutes long. And the one before lunch, it was awesome. Like everything went great. It was just wonderful. And then the one after lunch, it was like everyone was sleeping. And I'm like, oh no. Whereas in the morning, like I got tons of participation. And after lunch, well, number one, it was near Thanksgiving. So they served like a turkey and gravy and mashed potatoes. I think everyone might have been sleeping. Yeah. But also, I found out later, the group after lunch was just a quieter group. Mm-hmm. And so instead of being...
I'm sorry to interrupt, but it was different people.
Different people.
Different groups. Okay.
Different groups. Same company, but different groups.
Okay.
And I was like devastated because it was supposed to be 90 minutes long. And I think maybe we made it to 75 minutes because there just wasn't as much participation. And I went to the event coordinator. Her name was Nancy. And I'm like, oh, my goodness, I'm so sorry, blah, blah, blah. And she's like, I don't know what you're apologizing for. And she said, the people from the second group, like they'd already given her great feedback. It was the way I was perceiving it. But I really did think that's a failure because I wasn't prepared. I was so early in my career, Mark, I didn't know what to do when an audience wasn't engaging the way I thought they would. And so what grew out of that was every time I did a presentation, and I still continue this practice, I started thinking about, okay, so what went well and why? And specifically, what did I contribute? What did I do to contribute to the positive result? Because it's one thing if I'm just getting lucky, right? That's hard to duplicate. And then I started asking, okay, what didn't go as well as I wanted? Or what surprised me in this presentation and why? And what could I do differently in the future? Because I made a promise to myself after that event. I'm like, I will never be in that situation again where this happens and I've got nothing else in my toolbox. And so I started building out my toolbox. And then, over time, I always had backup activities. I always knew what to do. But that was, I was young. I was just getting started. So that's one of my favorites.
Well, I appreciate from your telling of the story, the reflection. And I mean, it doesn't sound like you were being hard on yourself, even though the client was happy. It sounds like it sounds like it was more of just a healthy, I want to improve. Maybe they won't be as understanding the next time. Maybe they will fault me, right?
That's right. Plus, you know what? I still felt like, even though the client wasn't upset, I still felt like I should have at least had something in my mind, something in my head, some kind of backup plan, because I didn't, and this client was very understanding, but I don't know, not every client would be. And I don't know, I might have been a little hard on myself back then, but
yeah.
But on the other hand, I also thought this is a great learning opportunity. It's a great learning opportunity.
Yeah. And that's part of what makes something a favorite mistake, the learning. And like, clearly this is stuck with you. Hopefully it's not bothering you.
Oh, no. No. But what's so funny about it, when you look back at a quote unquote mistake, especially when you learn from it, it's interesting to me how quickly you'll have another experience where you're like, man, I'm glad I had that previous experience because it taught you something. You know what I mean? And I had something, it was only like, I don't know, maybe 5 years after that. And I was doing an all-day presentation it was a client that I had for many years, and I'd met with the stakeholders ahead of time. And we had the whole thing planned out. And I was like 15 minutes into this presentation, and I asked a question to the group, and there was like this silence. And I'm like, oh man, I just asked a question that none of us are going to expect this answer. Like, you can kind of feel that, like we were not expecting this answer. And so finally someone spoke up, and I'm like, wow. And I could see like the CEO and the manager, they were all at the back of the room, and they looked surprised too. And it completely changed the direction of what was going to be helpful for that group. And I'm like, okay, so it seems like we need to shift a little bit. And everyone's like, yeah. And the CEOs at the back of the room, like, agreeing, like, let's shift. So at that point, I'm like, all right. I closed up the computer, shut down my PowerPoint, went the whole rest of the day just feeding off of what was in the room. Best presentation, one of the best presentations ever. Like, and I'm like, I'm so glad that I had that experience earlier, because it prepared me for that.
Yeah. I mean, and being able to learn from a mistake isn't a given, right? I mean, I think, we all make mistakes, but like, I love those questions that you talk through, similar questions that I've been taught and, I've tried to share when it comes to thinking about a mistake or even problem solving. These weren't your exact words back, but I think this is the gist of it, of like, what did I expect to happen? What actually happened? What was the cause of that difference? What did I learn? What am I going to do differently next time? I know you were more of like, what went well, what didn't, what was a surprise? But I think the spirit of those questions is the same. I think it's good to have a framework, whatever the framework is.
Whatever the framework, just a way for you to reflect and not just get caught in the, I'm just going to beat myself up, from here till eternity about this, because there's no real value in that. Or I'm just going to protect myself from it. I'm just going to say, well, it's their fault. They picked the wrong lunch. I'm not,
they should have given me a more engaging group. Or no.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
exactly. No, I mean, those experiences are co-created. So we're just looking at, what did I do and what could I do differently in the future? And that's powerful.
Yeah. Now, did you run into that exact situation? What about next time, whether there was turkey involved or not? Like, I imagine we've all been with some groups that are, like you said, more talkative than others, all other things being equal. And it's not always your fault. It could be the dynamics of like, are they quiet or are they just kind of afraid to speak up because of something that has nothing to do with you?
That's right.
Did you run into that again in a very direct way, or did it just reinforce the need for backup plans?
I did run into it again. And I think because a lot of the work I did, a lot of it was with either sales teams or sales managers, and they would have like 2-day workshops followed with coaching. So you're always going to have the afternoon lull. Like, it doesn't matter. So number one, what I learned there is, you know what? It's really good to plan it out so that shortly after lunch, you have them up, moving around the room in group discussions, right? I mean, that's easy. That's an easy thing to do. But also, to your point about the, sometimes groups are quieter when that happens. And it's like, okay, well, if I have a quieter group, a lot of times, you know what they need? They need time to talk amongst themselves or time to reflect before they're ready to share with the group. So it just became that recognizing what's going on with the learner, what's going on with the participant, and not just taking it personally, like, oh my God, they don't like me. And it's like, no, they just have different learning styles. Guess what, Bobbi? It's not all about you. But yeah, I mean, it's going to happen. Those things are just going to happen.
Yeah.
So you have to adapt.
Yeah. After lunch activities of anything that gets people up and standing and moving around. That's a great time of day if you've got some sort of simulation or exercise or something. And I can even think of time recently where we kind of had a schedule agenda planned out, but sometimes you read the room, you're like, you know what, let's do the exercise now.
Yeah.
I think we need that now. We can,
right. Or pull in another one.
Yeah.
Have one in your back pocket that's like, hey, if I need to, we can do that here. But also, Mark, it goes to what you're talking about, reading the room. And that's obviously everyone knows you're supposed to do that when you're just getting out. I think that can be harder because you're more in your head versus, hey, I've seen this before. I'm not surprised by it. It's okay. We can get through this in a powerful way. Yeah.
Yeah. We can get through it and we can learn and be better prepared. I love the way how you stated that you were almost happy that happened because it prepared you for future success.
Mm-hmm. Completely. I think that's the way it is often with your mistakes, or it can be. Hopefully.
Can be. Yeah. And I think part of that is, how we react individually. And I try to work on that, myself. And then when there's a team dynamic, there's how your colleagues or how your manager is reacting to mistakes.
That's a whole other thing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How much? Well, maybe we can talk about both of those pieces, like when it comes to individuals or to teams. So one thing that you talk about a lot, I was looking to explore here, is when people feel stuck.
Yeah.
And in some ways, if I don't know if that's a mistake of like we're paralyzed or we're just stuck, we don't know how to break through this. What are some of the ways that you help individuals or teams with that kind of situation?
Yeah. And here's part of it. We get stuck for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes we're stuck because we just continue to see things in the same way, right? We continue the same self-talk. And we kind of expect it to go one way. And, what we know from neuroscience is if we think whatever we look for, we're going to see, right? So that's one way of being stuck. Another way, and this is one of the most common ways I've seen people get stuck, is they want to try something new, let's say, but they think, but I have to have the whole plan. I have to know all the answers before I get started. And that's a trap because you can't know all the answers before you. I mean, it's impossible to know all the answers.
Except maybe in very, very simple situations.
Yeah, right. Very simple. And so it's always so much more powerful to get started and trust that you can learn what you need to learn along the way. And I've coached more than 3,000 people over the course of my career. And I can promise you can learn what you need to learn along the way. We're incredibly resourceful that way as learners. And then I think that the way it also ties into getting stuck to your podcast, my favorite mistake is we're paralyzed at the thought of making a mistake or failing. We're absolutely, we can be paralyzed by that as though our self-worth is tied up in oh my God, what happens if I make a mistake? And I think you're gonna make a mistake, and that's okay. Like, I love cross-country skiing. Love it. We have a place in Colorado just so we can go cross-country skiing as much as we want. And my husband, like, he always reminds me, because he's a better skier than I am. When I was first getting started, I didn't want to fall. Like, I don't want to fall. I don't want to fall. So what did I do? I stayed on the safest trails where there was virtually no chance of falling unless I just, lost my balance.
Yeah.
But that meant I didn't go up any hills. I didn't go down any hills. There was no variance in the terrain. And at one point he's like, you know what? If you're not falling once in a while, you're not pushing yourself hard enough.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one time he told me that after I'd gone down this big hill and I landed in a snowbank, and it's like, wait till I get on the snowbank before you remind me of that. But I think that's part of it. Like we have to become comfortable with the fact that we can make a mistake and we're still okay
Mm-hmm.
as a person. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. You're making me think of times I fell. So I grew up in Michigan, and we would go up into northern Michigan and go cross-country skiing. My dad still does that. He's quite avid cross-country skier, even up in Canada. But when I'm thinking back now of times I fell, either coming down a hill or just being in a situation where, okay, you fall. I'm trying, like, none of us really consciously remember learning how to walk, probably.
Mm-mm.
Right.
Mm-mm.
But learning to ski or learning to ride a bike or learning to do something new as an adult kind of brings in all sorts of different feelings of shame, or I shouldn't fall, or it's just that babies, thankfully, like, they're not saddled with that. I mean, I'm not a child psychologist, but it seems like, no, babies just go and they do it and they fall and they either laugh or they cry and they try again.
They get back up. That's a great example. I'm really glad because that triggered a memory. This was back, oh gosh, I don't know, 14 years ago or something like that. It was a while ago. I was going to say a couple of years ago. I'm like, no, it's more than a decade ago. I got to go to a coaching conference that Harvard put on, and John Whitmore was there. And John Whitmore wrote Coaching for Performance. He's kind of a legend in coaching circles. And he was on the main stage. And he said, why is it when a child is learning to walk, we don't say, and they fall, we don't say, oh my God, they made a mistake. They failed.
No, we don't laugh at the baby.
No, we say, they're learning how to walk.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, why don't we give ourselves and the people around us that same grace when we're adults?
Right.
But we don't. I mean, if you're learning something new, you're going to make a mistake. And it's not even a mistake. It's just everything's not going to go perfectly.
So what have you found helps people really try to embrace that if they are paralyzed or held back by that fear of making mistakes? It's one thing to kind of mentally process, and I hear you of like, okay, right, I shouldn't be afraid of mistakes. But if that's easier said than done,
it is.
how can we help people try to work through some of that?
Yeah. Here's what I suggest. Now, some people naturally embrace that. They have no problem with it. But if you're not one of those people, that's okay. First of all, don't be upset with yourself, right? It's natural. It's a very natural thing. So what I tell people is, or what I have over the years, in some situations, is to pick something small, right? That you can try. And if you fail, in quotes, air quotes, if you fail, it's not going to have big repercussions, but then to also journal about it, right? So the worst just happened, right? The worst thing just happened. You actually failed at something, no matter how small it was. Now what? How do you feel? I had a guest on my show. He grew up with really severe speech problems, and his biggest fear in life when he was a kid, because he has a very difficult last name to say, is that he would stutter over his own name. He was at camp and he stuttered over his last name and couldn't say it. And he went back to the little bunkhouse thing and he was like, wait a minute. The very thing I was so afraid of just happened. And I'm still here. And he said it was the best thing possible. So sometimes when we can, experience it and then journal about it, reflect on it, like, wait a minute, I'm still okay. What did I learn from it? And I think the other thing is to add in the what did I learn from it, or what could I learn from it? But it's hard to get past the shame. And that's where there is there's a science called positive intelligence, PQ for short. And we beforehand, we were talking about those assessments, the self-sabotage assessments that I have on the website. This is where that could come in handy, because each of us have, what neuroscientists have learned is all of us have a judge inside of our head, right? The inner critic judges ourselves, judges others, judges circumstances. We also have, they've identified 9 different inner saboteurs. And depending on which one you have, it can make it harder for you. Like, one is the stickler, the perfectionist. For a stickler, a mistake is like driving nails through their hand. I mean, it's so hard. So part of it is understanding what kind of self-talk you have going on, recognizing that in the moment, and that takes a little bit of practice, and that's called the saboteur interceptor muscle. But intercepting that thought, stopping it, and then replacing whatever that talk is with the, hey, I'm okay. I'm still okay. So it's recognizing what's going on in our head. Does that make sense?
It does. And I mean, it seems like it would help not just to have like some awareness there, but some coaching, or somebody, or a colleague, or I don't know if you ever have people coaching each other of
Yes.
asking like, hey, if I'm not being mindful of, let's say, judgmental language. So like one thing I think is interesting is like when people judge themselves, and people sometimes use this language on the podcast, and I wish they wouldn't, of like, oh, that was a dumb mistake.
Oh, no.
And I catch myself. I caught myself a couple of weeks ago, and I'm like, that was really dumb mistake. Now, at least I had the awareness, and I kind of caught myself and tried to remind myself,
right,
these ideas we talk about here on the podcast of it's okay. We all make mistakes. We can better choose in a way our reaction to the mistake. But I could see like maybe some sort of buddy system where if I wasn't being mindful, like Bobbi, let's say, you might call and say, hey, oh, Mark, wait a minute. I don't think you realize, but you just said this thing that you maybe didn't want to be saying. I'm not saying that clearly, but I don't know.
But I get what you're saying, and it's a great idea. I mean, so with the positive intelligence, there's a book that people can read. And number one, once you start becoming aware of it, awareness is key. Got to become aware of it. As for the buddy system, you can have an agreement with someone like, hey, like, let's say that you work in an office and you're close to one of your coworkers, and that this would feel comfortable. But you could say, hey, when you hear me beating myself up, or when you hear me using judging language towards myself, would you just gently raise it? And you can gently raise it. Like my husband and I went through the PQ program together. And so you don't really want to come across and say, hey, Rick, that's my husband. I just heard you say blah, 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 blah. But you can say, I just heard you say X, and just repeat back. It's called a neutral observation. Like, hey, Mark, I just heard you classify that as a dumb mistake. And that's it. Just kind of raise the awareness, no judgment. And then you can say, oh, yeah, I did.
Yeah.
I did.
Don't judge the judgment or shame the shaming.
Yeah. It's just like, oh, I heard you say X. And you can leave it at that. It's just a way to raise it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because other people can sometimes hear it quicker than we do.
Yeah.
But you can train yourself at the same time.
Yeah. And, I think you raise a lot of good points. And this applies, I think, to, say, individual situations or entrepreneurship, of the idea of making a change small. If the idea of change is scary, make it small, start somewhere. Like I've heard, people use the phrase baby steps. There we go, back to kids again.
That's right.
There's something to it of kind of minimizing some of the risk, or minimizing, if people say, what's the worst that could happen, making that worst kind of small.
And the other thing that's related to that, and this is one of my favorite things that I've used in coaching, and people can use this for themselves. Don't ask yourself to change. Ask yourself to test it. Because testing it, you're experimenting, right? So when you test something, when you experiment, you expect that you might have some missteps. That makes it so much less scary.
Well, back to your point from earlier, we don't have to have it all figured out.
Nah.
By definition, an experiment means we don't have it all figured out. And to give permission for that.
That's right. That's right. And it's so funny because over the years, anytime I've said that to someone I'm coaching, like, hey, I'm not asking you to change. I'm just wondering, is it something that you're willing to test? I've never had anyone say no. I haven't. No one's ever said no. I've had like 2 people who said, I'll try it just to prove you wrong. Like, I don't care. And then they tried it and they're like, okay, well, I tried it. And you know what? It was actually okay. But that's okay. Make it fun too. We make things so serious all the time. The journey should be fun. Learning should be fun. That's when we learn the most, is when it's fun.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, that you brought up something you made me think of this go and test it. And somebody saying, well, okay, yeah, I'm going to try it and prove that you're wrong. That kind of made me think of something you said earlier of you get what you see what you are looking for.
Yeah.
Kind of trying to paraphrase it back that if you're expecting it to fail, people will, I think, sometimes give up too quickly. Like, yes. Well, see, I tried it. It didn't work. So I give up. But, from that initial stumble or struggle, so one other thing I wanted to ask you about was, finding a way forward.
Yeah.
How do you help people realize that if we've tried something, if we're learning, if we're testing, and if we've stumbled, to look for the way forward? Is there always a way forward instead of giving up and saying, well, look, it didn't work?
Yeah. So first of all, I believe that there's always a way forward. Now, we might not always like all the options, but that doesn't mean they're not viable options. So the first thing is we have to believe that there is a way forward. If we believe, because here's the thing, if we believe there's a way forward, our brain will look for that way. If we believe that there is no way forward, we've ended the conversation. There's no point for our brain to scan and try to find a way forward. Back in 2003, I got really sick, almost died. A doctor gave me a 3% chance of a full recovery. Yeah. And the first thought that went through, well, not the first thought that went through my first thought was, okay, when do I get to go for a run again? And he's like, Bobbi, your days of being an athlete might be over. And I'm happy to report that he was wrong, because I now cycle mountain passes. But one of the first things that occurred to me when he said that was, so that means that 3% of the people have the answer, or their doctors do. So I need to find them. And I share that because that's a really important piece. Number one, I believe there is a way forward. And number two, sometimes we mistake the fact, we think, well, I don't know the way forward. That means there is no way.
Right.
No. Right? We just have to look for it. That's our job, is to look for it.
Right.
And to try different things.
And that's the thing. Yeah. Trying, that willingness to go forward and try things as opposed to knowing the answer. And a lot of organizations have this bad habit of, I think, really conditioning people of like, you need to know, or at least you pretend to know. And then I think that gets people in trouble when they end up, having to double down on something that turned out to be a mistake instead of being able to acknowledge it as such.
Isn't it funny how hard it is in organizations? It all depends on culture, and it depends on the leadership. Some leaders are amazing at making mistakes. Okay. Right. Or just trying new things. But others, it's almost like you're punished. There's a great book by 2 Stanford professors, Pfeffer and Sutton, The Knowing Doing Gap. Okay. And they studied, why is there such a gap between what we know we should do and what we actually do? And one of the things they found in organizations, that people get punished for failed action. Like, they try something, it doesn't work, they get punished or ridiculed or whatever it might be. And what they say is, we should be rewarding it when someone has the initiative to take action. And they said, don't punish failed action, punish inaction. But we don't.
Yeah.
Too often we don't. I shouldn't say we never do.
Yeah. Well, think of how many organizations will say things like, having a bias for action is one of our traits or beliefs or principles, or
one of our values.
But I mean, there's thoughtful action, right? If we have a bias, that bias for action might include, bias, for making assumptions and rushing into things, which maybe that's not the right kind of action. I see your point about not being, just stuck with the comfortable status quo, right? How do we find the balance there?
Yeah, because it's hard, but people who are actually trying to do something, I mean, I cannot think of a single thing, Mark, whether it's a sport that I've played, when I tried to learn musical instruments, I love to cook, learning cooking, whatever it might be, you're going to have missteps. Gordon Ramsay probably originally did not come out, he probably had to work to get that, what's his famous one? The beef Wellington, right? Beef Wellington is a technical dish. I'm guessing he had a few that maybe weren't perfect along the way. You know what I mean? Like, it's learning. It's not failing or making mistakes. It's simply learning.
Yeah. But are we laughing? I don't know. Is Gordon Ramsay laughing or being mean to people who are new at something and trying in some of the cooking shows? I don't know.
Yeah. Some of them, and yet sometimes he's so, because I actually started watching him because at first I don't like that. I don't like all the yelling. And I started watching it, and there are times when he's amazingly gracious and supportive,
Yeah.
So
I mean, it's been a long time, but I mean, I've watched. I know he has a number of shows, but Kitchen Nightmares.
Oh God, I never watched that one.
We watched for a while, and if I remember right, like I think what really upsets him is sort of like an unearned arrogance of somebody where there's a gap between they think their restaurant or their service or their food is really good or even really safe, and it is not. That's when it seems like he gets the most upset with people. If somebody was just an eager learner who admitted they weren't perfect,
that's different.
Yeah.
I think the arrogance does bother him quite a bit. And I don't know. I don't even know the guy, but yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. So, again, we've been joined today by Bobbi Kahler. Before we wrap up, Bobbi, tell us a little bit about your podcast, The Unyielded Show.
Yeah. Thank you so much for asking. So it's a podcast I started back in 2020, and it's about working on our inner game, who we are, and, our mindset, our behaviors, as a way to affect our outer game results, happiness, well-being, and success. And so I've got 2 episodes a week. One, they come out on Wednesdays. Those are interview formats where I interview, interesting people who have both a story to tell and also what they learned from it, with that. And then on Mondays, I have, I call it Rise and Thrives. They're 10-minute little monologues where I share something that, gives people insight and actionable things to work on. Yeah. Part of the reason I started it, Mark, is, as I said this before, in my career, I've coached more than 3,000 people. I've learned a lot about coaching. I've learned a lot about human performance, and a lot of this stuff we can do on our own. And so what I want to do with the podcast is really give back. I don't really coach very much anymore, only for very select clients, but this is my way of sharing what I've learned so that other people can take it and they can use it and they can coach themselves. So that's my goal with the podcast.
Yeah. That's great. I hope people will check it out. They can, I'm sure, find it wherever they are listening to my mistake. And Bobbi does have a website. I'll make sure there's a link in the show notes, bobbikahler.com. People can sign up for a newsletter. You have some email education that goes out. Tell people about that real quick.
Yeah. So when someone signs up for the newsletter, which of course is free, they get it's a free 5-day email course. And it's kind of a jump start on finding your forward and preparing yourself for that inner game. So I tackle things like mindset, behaviors, and those types of things.
Okay. Well, I hope people will check that out. Now I'm going to go dig a little more into positive intelligence, PQ.
Yeah.
That's a new term for me. And to go look at, your assessment about looking for some of these inner saboteurs. Is that, do I have the phrase right?
They're inner saboteurs. Yeah. And on the website, on the resource page, there's 2 assessments. The one to identify which saboteurs you might have. And then another one will tell you your PQ score, which essentially tells you how much of the time is your mind working for you versus against you. And both of those, it's very eye-opening. It was very, very helpful.
I bet. So I'm going to go sign up for that. So thank you for,
thank you.
Thank you for sharing those resources, and thank you for being a guest here and telling your story, not just the mistake, but I think, to share your thought process about reflection and improvement. Really, really helpful to hear how you talk through that. I know that's going to help others. So thank you for everything you shared and talked about here today.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Well, thanks again to Bobbi Kahler for being our guest, sharing her story and more here today. To learn more about her and everything she does, look for links in the show notes, or you can go to markraven.com/mistake227. As always, I want to thank you for listening. I hope this podcast inspires you to reflect on your own mistakes, how you can learn from them or turn them into a positive. I've had listeners tell me they started being more open and honest about mistakes in their work. And they're trying to create a workplace culture where it's safe to speak up about problems, because that leads to more improvement and better business results. If you have feedback or a story to share, you can email me, myfavoritemistakepodcast@gmail.com. And again, our website is myfavoritemistakepodcast.com.